You're listening to the Fierce Fatty Podcast, episode 114. Today we're talking about the latest science on trauma and weight. I'm your host, Vinnie Wellsby. Let's do it.
Perfect.
I'm Victoria Wellsby, TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and fat activist. I have transformed my life from hating my body with desperately low self-esteem to being a courageous and confident, fierce fatty who loves every inch of this jelly. Society teaches us living in a fat body is bad, but what if we spent less time, money, and energy on the pursuit of thinness and instead focused on the things that actually matter, like if pineapple on pizza should be outlawed, or if the mullet was the greatest haircut of the 20th century. So, how do you stop negative beliefs about your fat body controlling your life? It's the Fierce Fatty Podcast. Let's begin. Hello, fatties and fatty allies. Welcome to this episode. Nice to see you. Nice to talk to you. How are you? You're right. How's life? Fair to middling. I made a post of a tweet that I saw, and I thought it was so fucking cute. It's a tweet from like 2019, but it's talking about sled dogs, and I'm going to read it out to you. Okay. So the person who tweeted it originally is Blair Braverman on Twitter, and I'll put a link in the show notes of the post. So I made it into an Instagram post for you, because you can get to see the dogs, you can get to see the puppies. But the post reads, y'all, because they're American. Let's pretend they're American. I don't know. Actually, I don't think they are. Y'all, having sled dogs has been so good for my body image, and not because mushing is joy-filled physical outdoor activity. Although that's true, it's actually something much simpler than that. Okay, I'm going to stop doing my shitty accent, and I apologize. I don't even think this person is American. Anyway, if that was an American accent. Y'all, having sled dogs has been so good for my body image, and not because mushing is a joy-filled physical outdoor activity, although that's true. It's actually something much simpler than that. And there's a picture of a yellow lab dog with an orange tutu going along with that. Continuing, I grew up learning that all bodies are different. Okay, yeah, that's true. Whatever. All bodies are different. I get it. And then I started caring for sled dogs. I feed and train and massage them, teach them as puppies, and ease them into retirement. We get to know each dog so well. And once we started doing this, do you know what became extremely obvious? And they've got a little picture of the puppies. Get this. All bodies are different. But I don't mean this in some flip way. I mean in a bone-deep, beautiful, complicated way. All the dogs' bodies are so different. Some of them eat thousands of calories a day and are still complete string beans. They eat literally 3 times as much food as everyone else. Some of them can eat like a tablespoon of kibble, and the next day they need a bigger harness. They're easy keepers. Their bodies naturally want to be bigger, which is good. Easy keepers make great sled dogs. Some of them can start training in September and are immediately ready for the long runs. Some of them need to ease into training slowly, but they need gentler workouts and more training sessions before they can keep up with the rest of the team. Some of them want to run 1,000 miles. This is my favourite picture. If you go on the post, go and look at that one. Silly dog. This is a dog, silly, so cute. His ears all floppy. Continuing, some of them feel their best doing shorter, faster runs, and occasionally some of them aren't that into running at all. Some of them have disabilities, and so on that one they've got a little dog. I don't know what inside next to the fireplace, chewing on something with a blanket, and then there's another dog there it looks like maybe that dog's blind or has cataracts in their eyes. Anyway, some of them were born with bodies that make everything harder for them, and they need extra care and understanding to really shine. The point is, their bodies are so different, but the differences aren't good or bad, they just are. We don't love Talisi more or less because he's skinny, or Colbert because he's a chonkster. The idea makes no sense. It's absurd. And my body is like that too. It has its own set points, its own levels. So does yours. The dogs' bodies aren't up to them, just like ours aren't. There's no value judgment. They are what they are. And every single one of them is magnificent. The end. And then the final picture is of a dog getting a scratch under their chin and looking all smiley with their eyes closed, with their tongue in their mouth, looking happy. I thought that was so cute, and lots of people put messages saying, I love it, and I think I loved it too. So let's start with that. So, I think a lot of people say, oh, I can get it now that it's about dogs. Of course I don't love my one dog more because it's this or that and versus another dog. Like my little doogie. He's just I just love him, right? I don't care what he looks like. He's a silly little sausage. So today I wanted to. Today is going to be like an audiobook, almost, because I'm going to read an article to you. It's not my article. I didn't write it. It's from Judith Matz, who is an incredible person in the fat positive community, who wrote a piece for Psychotherapy Networker, and it just really stuck with me. I was thinking about this. About I've done an episode on are people fat because of trauma before. Judith has written a new piece on the latest science, and the idea that in mental health worlds, in mental health fields, there is still this pervasive belief that fatness is caused by trauma. And even in supposedly progressive spaces, this is still a belief. And people think, well, what's the harm in that? Because they're not blaming the fat people. But, it's, yeah. Let me read this article, okay? It's probably maybe take me 20 minutes to read it, so you can just sit back, relax. I might give some commentary here and there, but I'm gonna link to it, by the way, in the show notes. Show notes for today's podcast, fiercefatty.com/114 for episode 114. If you ever forget whatever number that you're looking for, then you can just go to /podcast, not just /podcast, fiercefatty.com /podcast for the latest podcast. Okay. Are you settled in? Are you sitting comfortably? Are you feeling good? Okay, let's read this. Okay. Unlearning Weight Stigma, the latest science on trauma and weight by Judith Matz. January-February 2022. A few years back, when professional meetings were all still happening in person, I found myself amidst fellow therapists grabbing the last seat in a packed conference ballroom. We waited expectantly for the presenter, popular trauma expert Gabor Mate. After a keynote speech earlier in the day, in which he'd argued that much of our suffering isn't biological or individual failure, but one stemming from the traumatizing nature of the culture we live in, I realized that Mate's viewpoint aligned with how I see diet culture and the impact of weight stigma. As a medical doctor offering compassionate addiction treatment in Vancouver, Mate's willingness to see beyond the addiction to the traumatized person it consumes has made him a sought-after teacher in the larger world of trauma treatment. As someone who specializes in binge eating, body image, and weight stigma, I resonated with his capacity to see the entirety of a person in the context of their environment. So when a workshop participant a few rows behind me stood up to ask him about the connection between quote-unquote obesity and trauma, I listened with interest. He correctly pointed out that fat shaming is a problem, but then went on to say that the reason quote-unquote obese people don't lose weight is that they need to keep eating to soothe pain. Almost reflexively, my arm shot up, and before I knew it, a microphone was shoved into my hand. I leaned into the mic, my heart pounding, and said, "Some people may binge eat to soothe pain, but the assumption that everyone will lose weight if they stop binging, or that all higher weight people binge, is wrong." Mate paused, then asked me, "Are you familiar with the work of Vincent Felitti?" I immediately knew where he was going with this question. Felitti was behind a study that in part suggests that sexually abused women seek to protect themselves from further abuse by gaining weight and keeping it on. In The Body Keeps the Score, trauma specialist Bessel van der Kolk describes how the observations of Felitti, an internist and chief of preventative medicine at Kaiser Permanente, led to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. So if you don't know the ACE scale, it says basically, actually, I'll just continue because it says it just right here. I don't need to tell you. Feletti's work identified not only the extent to which the general population experiences trauma during their youth, but also gave practitioners a simple ranking scale of traumatic experiences that could help identify who's more apt to engage in high-risk behaviors, the outcomes of which include addiction, unintended pregnancies, sexually transmitted diseases, and, quote, obesity. Feletti's ideas about the whys of higher weights are now widely accepted, especially the idea that someone of higher weight maintains that weight because of trauma. In fact, more often than not, this is offered up less as a possibility and more as a full-blown assumption on the part of too many professionals. You see evidence of it everywhere, particularly given the popularity of ACEs in the therapy and healthcare world. In her book, The Deepest Well, California's Surgeon General Nadine Burke-Harris repeats the story of Feletti's discovery, saying it goes, quote, a long way towards explaining why his most successful patients, the ones who had peeled off that protective layer, were so desperate to put it back on, end quote. Feletti headed up his, quote, obesity clinic from the mid-80s to the late 90s using what he called supplemented absolute fasting to bring about dramatic weight loss. Patients ate no solid food, only liquids, and supplemented by essential vitamins, amino acids, and electrolytes. One of his female patients lost 276 pounds over the course of a year, and when she regained weight, surprise, surprise, Felitti attributed her rapid weight gain solely to the distress caused by a male co-worker beginning to express sexual interest in her. 10 days after learning of this particular patient's history of sexual abuse, Felitti came across another patient with a history of sexual trauma and rapid weight gain. According to van der Kolk, this was, quote, only the second case of incest Felitti had seen in his 23-year medical practice. End quote. But when half of the quote, obese patients in the initial study later revealed they'd also been sexually abused, he settled on the idea that there must be a link between higher weight and abuse, and a correlation between weight gain and protection against further sexual trauma. He did this without researching rates of sexual abuse among thinner people. Well. Felitti, only having heard about 2 cases of incest in his career, says more about his not knowing to ask his subjects about sexual trauma than it does about the frequency of abuse. As we now know, people of all sizes are survivors of incest and sexual assault, and only recently in the era of #MeToo have many felt emboldened to share their experience. From a statistical standpoint, there's nothing surprising about Folletti's finding. Given that 2/3 of Americans fall into a higher weight category, it's to be expected that the majority of people who've experienced sexual abuse are higher weight. Yet, many practitioners today have come to interpret Folletti's work as proof positive that sexual or other trauma underlies most cases of, quote, obesity and the inability to permanently lose weight. Psychologist Deb Bugard, a leader in the Health for Every Size movement, puts it this way, quote, the majority of people who blink are higher weight. If sexual abuse and body size are totally unrelated, we'd see that the majority of people who've experienced sexual abuse being higher weight. Someone arguing that fat people are less likely to have experienced sexual abuse could just as truthfully say that the majority of people who have not experienced sexual abuse are higher weight, end quote. Even more important than statistics is biology. To those of us who work in this area, it's clear that consistently attributing weight regain to trauma and fear of sexual attention is an outright denial of the science. It's no surprise that Folletti's patients rapidly gained back the weight following extreme fasts. Research on this behavior dates to World War II, when conscientious objectors who agreed to take part in a study on starvation lost a quarter of their body weight and became irritable, depressed, lethargic, and obsessed with food. Once freed to eat what they wanted again, the men binged for weeks but stayed ravenous as their bodies sought to become renourished. I did a whole episode on that. That's the Minnesota starvation experiment. And I also cover in that episode the Warszawa ghetto study. Very interesting stuff, which is basically making people lose weight is not good. And other things. Okay, continue. More recently, a study of former participants in The Biggest Loser television show demonstrated the physiological consequences of intentional weight loss. When the show began, their metabolisms burned the typical number of calories for their body size. They had slower metabolisms at the end of the show, as would be true for just about anyone who suppresses their weight through intentional weight loss. The big surprise was that their resting metabolisms remained permanently lowered, demonstrating that weight regulation is more than a matter of calories in and calories out. Binging after a diet is everybody's natural way of trying to protect itself from perceived famine. A recent weight loss study of nearly 300,000 people found that within 5 years, between 95 and 98% of people had gained back all of the lost weight or more. Folletti was reportedly looking for a trigger event to explain weight regain. It never occurred to him that the physiological response to dieting for weight loss might be it. Don't assume you know your client's history. There's no doubt that binging is a survival strategy for many trauma survivors, including sexual assault survivors, and that it can lead to weight gain, especially if they try to change their weight through dieting. But I reject the implication that all higher weight people who try to lose weight and then gain it back should be assumed to do so to protect themselves from sexual attraction or trauma-based shame. Why does this distinction matter so much? When those of us in the therapy world assume that higher weight individuals have a sexually or otherwise traumatic past, it adds another layer to the fat shaming and weight stigma they're already likely enduring. And as Gabor Mate emphasized in his presentations, exposure to stigma worsens physical health. In the book Anti-Diet, intuitive eating dietitian Christy Harrison explains the impact of weight stigma on allostatic load, or the cumulative effect of chronic stressors on multiple systems in the body, which can worsen like diabetes and heart disease. A large 10-year study found those impacted by weight stigma were twice as likely to have a high allostatic load, making it a, quote, an independent risk factor for physiological stress. Along these lines, therapists should be aware that within size acceptance communities, the word fat has been reclaimed as a neutral, adjective, or positive identity, and that, as I expressed to Mate, the term obesity is in itself a fat-shaming world. I fucking love that this interaction happened, and I hope Gaber Mate listened. Anyway, continue. In 2013, the American Medical Association declared against the recommendations of its own scientific advisory board obesity to be a disease. Higher weight people with health markers that fall in a normal range are now considered diseased within the medical field, including, according to one study, 54 million people incorrectly labelled as unhealthy when relying on the BMI. If you check in with your higher weight clients, you'll find the probability that they haven't been fat shamed by the medical community to be extremely low. What's more likely is that they've been given harmful medical interventions in the name of weight loss, while not receiving adequate medical care for actual health conditions. They certainly don't also need their therapist to be offering interventions based on stigma and stereotypes. Take my recent conversation with Grammy-nominated singer Mary Lambert, a fat queer woman best known for her collaboration with the Macklemore song Same Love. That's a good song, that is. Over the course of my life, I've had several therapists tell me that I was fat because I subconsciously wanted to be undesirable and desexualized after sexual trauma, she said. I didn't see it as a harmful thing at the time, but in retrospect, the fact that some therapists perpetuate the concept of pathologizing fatness is incredibly awful and damaging. Women who've been sexually assaulted or experienced trauma deserve coping mechanisms that aren't harmful. What a blessing, then, is food. Not a drug or an addictive substance, just the comfort of fullness. I'm so thankful for those behaviors that soothed me at a painful time. But we also have to stop attributing the behaviors of emotional eating to every fat person and interrupt the belief that thin people don't emotionally eat. Separate the behavior from the characteristic of being fat. They are two different things, and you have no idea what someone's habits are. End quote. Lambert's healed many of the wounds of her trauma, made peace with food, and found a loving relationship, and she remains at a higher weight. If our anti-fat bias leads us to conclude she must still be protecting herself from unwanted sexual attention, must have a food problem, is physically unhealthy, or even that high weight people can't be sexually desirable, then we're complicit in upholding weight stigma and promoting the interventions for weight loss that are so damaging. Yes, and that's another thing that I wanted to mention, is that by saying, even just by saying that people are fat to protect themselves from sexual advances, is making the presumption that being fat is so unattractive that it would protect from sexual advances. And when we're talking about sexual assault, that it's the person who owns the body's fault for being sexually assaulted, when it's not. And it's not about being attracted to someone. It's about power, right? And so it's just so many false assumptions and harmful assumptions there. Okay, continuing. Fat shaming with a clinical brush. I hear this dread of fat assumptions, fat shaming, and diet prescriptions by professionals from many of my clients. You very likely have clients who also feel this dread. Perhaps you feel it too. Higher weight people often avoid going to doctors or therapists because the stigma they experience is untenable. We know that, for example, fat women have higher rates of cervical cancer because they're likelier than thin people to avoid getting pap smears due to the weight discrimination and prejudice they experience at the doctor's office. Fat shaming and weight discrimination can even prove deadly. Take the case of Ellen Maud Bennett, a higher weight woman repeatedly told by medical providers that weight loss was the solution to her ailments, when it turned out that she actually had cancer. Her obituary reads, "A final message Ellen wants to share was about the fat shaming she endured from the medical profession. Over the past few years of feeling unwell, she'd sought out medical intervention, but no one had offered any support or suggestions beyond weight loss. Ellen's dying wish was that women of size make her death matter by advocating strongly for their health and not accepting that fat is the only relevant health issue. The therapy community has long prided itself on being an alternative to the hurried and often insensitive medical establishment, but it continues to contribute to the problem. If we automatically paint our higher weight clients with a clinical brush labeled sexual trauma survivor, we'll only further alienate clients already sensitive to our anti-fat biases, promote the unnuanced belief that fat is a mental health issue, and expect weight loss to be evidence of healing. Among the revered work of existential therapist Ivan Yalom is his story, Fat Lady, in which he describes his strong reaction to the body of his client Betty. In an afterward written 25 years later that acknowledges the letters he received from higher weight women about the story's offensiveness, he owns the detrimental impact of his bias and says therapists need to openly explore similar biases in supervision so they're not imposed on the client. According to the Rudd Center, psychologists ascribe more pathology, more negative and severe symptoms, and worse prognosis to fat patients compared to thinner patients presenting identical psychological profiles. And a recent review of Harvard's implicit bias studies showed a decrease in all categories except weight bias. Given that we have no evidence-based means of achieving sustainable weight loss for the vast majority of people, we also need to ask ourselves, why do we continue to use weight loss as a measure for psychological healing? Aubrey Gordon, the author of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, writes, whatever we want to think about ourselves, we've got to make the shift from thinking anti-fat bias as something we decide to do out of animus to something that exists within us unless and until we uproot it. Binge eating is an issue that can benefit from treatment, and it does attach to trauma. But questions about a history of any trauma should be asked of all clients, not just those at higher weights. And when working with clients who want to explore issues related to food and or body size, it's important to ask the right questions, such as, what can you tell me about your relationship with food? When was the first time someone said your body was a problem? What do you think would be different in your life if you lost weight? How have you been impacted by weight stigma and bias? It's important to remember that your higher weight clients often experienced weight-related bullying and shaming in childhood by peers, family, and health professionals. These messages become ingrained in the psyche, referred to as internalized weight stigma. According to Amy Pershing, co-author of Binge Eating Disorder, The Journey to Recovery and Beyond, the pathologizing of body size and prescriptions to restrict food intake limit their opportunity to identify and honor physical cues of hunger and fullness, and many have significant diet and weight cycling histories as a result. When there is trauma and binge eating. When binge eating is revealed to be a strategy for coping with emotional distress, therapists should be aware that developing body awareness and trust plays a critical role in lessening the impact of traumatic activation. But this is difficult when survivors of physical and sexual trauma experience connection with their bodies as a trigger for shame. Now in his late 30s, my client Tyler grew up in a physically abusive home with an alcoholic father. Once when he was in middle school and engrossed in a book, his dad called for him downstairs. When Tyler didn't respond immediately, his father stormed upstairs and broke down his door yelling, "You lazy, fat slob." For the rest of his childhood, Tyler had no bedroom door, thus no privacy amid the chaos in his home. Food became his go-to for soothing or numbing, and binging followed him through his college years and beyond, eventually becoming woven into his psyche as a way to care for himself. Now a manager at a large corporation, Tyler's embarrassed by his binge eating and higher weight body. This came to a head when his company offered employees a reduction in insurance rates determined by their weight. When Tyler first contacted me, he desperately wanted to lose weight so that he could save money and fit in better, quote, with co-workers. But no matter how many weight loss strategies he had tried, he couldn't get his weight, quote, under control. We worked with the concept of attuned eating, also known as intuitive eating, with full recognition that working his way out of diet mindset would take time. He managed to decrease the frequency of binging, but the pace of progress frustrated him, and he wanted to know when he would be, quote, cured. Though I couldn't tell him how long it would take to heal his relationship with food, I wanted him to develop compassion for his needs to turn to it during times of distress. Over time, Tyler came to appreciate how binging as a child helped him survive a chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous household. He began to understand that when his past trauma became activated, food was still his best option at times for calming his nervous system. He felt both angry and helpless that his workplace was essentially punishing him for his weight, especially now that he understood how dieting for weight loss actually exacerbated his binge eating. As we focused on building new skills to meet his needs in addition to turning to food, he began to notice that more time lapsed between binges, and that when a binge did occur, he could end it sooner than in the past. He also focused on ways to care for his body that did not require the pursuit of weight loss, including seeking medical care for his health conditions from a weight-neutral doctor. Anti-fat bias inherently assumes a thin body to be healthier, more desirable, and even virtuous. There is a goodness about being thin. This moralization of size further reinforces the body shame narratives clinicians are trying to treat. So it's imperative that we recognize that we're at cross purposes if we're trying to help clients heal from body shame by focusing on changing their bodies. Even if weight gain is the result of a trauma-driven eating disorder, the reality is that a client may or may not lose weight in the course of recovery. That's what it means to be weight neutral. Ultimately, Gabor Mate responded to my comments with openness and curiosity when I made a point at his workshop, and we continued our conversations throughout the conference. I've heard from many clients and colleagues that they find resources such as The Body Keeps the Score and The Deepest Well extremely helpful in understanding their own clients' trauma, but they're triggered by the Folletti material that blames body size on trauma, promotes weight loss, and ignores the lived experience of higher weight people. As mental health clinicians, we can do a better job of not contributing to this triggering. We can use language that describes their actual behavior, which is binging, and stop conflating, quote, obesity with trauma. We can understand the science of weight regulation and stop viewing higher weight bodies as pathological. I also urge those who treat trauma, and especially those who are leaders in the field, to familiarize themselves with the true nature of weight-based trauma so as not to further traumatize, albeit unintentionally, people who already experience weight stigma. The end. And it says, Judith Matz, LCSW, is a nationally recognized speaker and co-author of the Making Peace with Food card deck, the Body Positivity card deck, Beyond a Shadow of a Diet, and the Diet Survivor's Handbook. She has a private practice in the Chicago area. Contact judithmatz.com. Oh, can you imagine how lucky that patient Tyler that she was talking about got to meet her and not anyone else? Because how often is it that a patient gets to access care from a Hayes aligned provider? Like, one in a gajillion chance. Well, that's overstated, but it's, I'm so pleased that person had that good experience. And nice to hear that Gabor Mate was open, because he's from Vancouver, right, which is where I am, and it's really fatphobic, image based here. So they call it Hollywood North here, because they do lots of filming, but also it pretty much is Lululemon, yoga and smoothies type place. Vancouver's great, but like, that's a big part of the culture. Anyway, so loved that article, and so important. So, that the one quote that I really liked was about blinking. Basically, where is it? That Deb Bogard said that the majority of people who blink are higher weight. So if sexual abuse and body size are totally unrelated, we'd see this in the majority of people who've experienced sexual abuse being higher weight. So that idea of more fat people are more likely to get this and that and la 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 la, and fat people are more likely to blink. The majority of people who blink are higher weight because there's more fat people than there are thin people. I like that, and I did a little reading for you there. Did you like me reading? I made a few mistakes, but I think that hopefully I don't have a too annoying reading voice for you there. So a little article reading for you if you're going to work or walking the dog, whatever you're doing, going to sleep, doing the dishes. My favourite time to listen to relaxing podcasts is bedtime, but my favourite time for listening to funny podcasts is walking Dougal. Because, you don't want to be laughing when you're falling asleep, So I wonder when does my podcast go on in your life? I think my podcast is doing something, like doing the dishes, doing the laundry. That's what I think. Am I right? Are you doing the laundry right now? Are you having a walk right now? Yeah. That's all I wanted to share today. Hope that you're doing well and that you're alive and stuff. And everything's good for you. Oh, forgot to mention, I've been on a couple of dates with a human person. I had some smooches. I met someone who was like so forward-thinking and progressive. Everything that I talk about, social justice-wise, he's like, yes, and has tons of opinions, even on fat stuff. And he's a straight-sized guy. I'm just like, oh my God, this is amazing. So listen, there's people out there. There's people out there. He's like saying to me, oh, you need to start a plus-size store because there's only 2 places in Vancouver that I can shop. And he's like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And he's like, and plus-size clothes are so expensive. I'm like, yes. He was like, this is great. This is great. So if you're dating, not saying that this, I'm going to be with this guy forever or anything. I had a couple of dates with him, but just saying that there are progressive people out there who will be like, oh my God, yes, I agree with you about the ridiculousness of fatness. They exist, and you don't have to settle for people who are like, it's gross to be fat, which is unfortunately the majority of humans in the world have that opinion. Anyway, whatever, I'll stop get annoying. I'll stop talking about people who are annoying. Not that I'm annoying. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, whatever you're doing. If it's the laundry, if it's walking the dog, if it's having a poo, hope it's great for you. And we'll see you in the next episode. Okay, bye, crocodile. Thanks for listening to the episode. And if you feel ready to get serious about this work and want to know when the doors open to Fierce Fatty Academy, which is my signature program where I teach all about how to overcome your fat phobic beliefs and learn to love your fat body, then go to fiercefatty.com/waitlist. Again, that is fiercefatty.com/waitlist to get your name on the waitlist for when Fierce Fatty Academy, my signature program, opens.